Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Nalani stood frozen in the doorway of the glass conference room, her leather portfolio gripping tight against her ribs, like armor she forgot how to wear. The man sitting at the head of the mahogany table hadn't looked up yet, but she knew those hands. Long fingers tapping a silver pen against a tablet screen, the same restless rhythm he used to drum on his desk when he was thinking. 33 years had carved lines into her memory, but some things don't fade, they just wait. Garrett Finch, her former boss, the man who once held her entire future in his palm and crushed it without blinking. Now here he sat across from her in this Seattle high-rise, about to negotiate a multi-million-dollar partnership with her company. The air in the room tasted like expensive cologne and old shame, and Nalani felt 22 again, young, desperate, and invisible. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was 55, a CEO, and she had built herself from ashes he didn't even know he'd left behind. Garrett finally looked up, and his pale blue eyes widened just a fraction before he recovered. He stood, extending his hand with that practiced corporate smile she remembered too well, the one that never reached his eyes, the one that made decisions about people's lives over lukewarm coffee. "Ms. Reeves," he said, his voice smooth as river stones. "I've heard impressive things about your firm." Nalani shook his hand, her grip firm, her face a mask of professional warmth that cost her every ounce of strength she had. His palm was cool and dry. Hers was steady. She didn't let go first. "Mr. Finch," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of silence. "I'm sure you have." She watched something flicker behind his expression. Confusion, maybe recognition, but it passed like a shadow underwater. He didn't remember her. After everything, after the way he'd humiliated her in front of the entire marketing department, after he'd blocked her promotion and whispered to HR that she wasn't leadership material, he didn't even remember her face. The meeting began with spreadsheets and projections, voices discussing quarterly earnings and market positioning, but Nalani heard none of it. She was 22 again, standing outside Garrett's office in that cramped Chicago building on West Madison, her hands shaking as she held the report she'd stayed up 3 nights perfecting. She'd been so proud of that report, so sure it would prove she belonged at that table. Instead, Garrett had barely glanced at it before handing it to someone else. Todd, his favorite, a white guy fresh out of business school who spent more time playing golf than working. "This needs a stronger voice," Garrett had said, not even looking at her. "Todd will take the lead on this." Nalani had stood there, her chest hollow, watching her work get reassigned like it was nothing, like she was nothing. That was the moment she learned that being smart wasn't enough, being good wasn't enough. Being black and female in his world meant being a ghost. "Ms. Reeves?" A voice pulled her back. Garrett was staring at her, eyebrows raised. "Your thoughts on the Q3 timeline?" Nalani blinked, realizing the room had gone quiet, everyone waiting. She straightened in her chair, her burgundy blazer suddenly feeling like a suit of armor that actually fit. "The timeline works if your team can deliver on the metrics you've promised," she said evenly. "But I'll need guarantees. My company doesn't partner with firms that overpromise and underdeliver." She watched Garrett's jaw tighten, just slightly. Good. Let him feel a fraction of what she'd felt. Around the table, her team exchanged glances, proud, knowing looks that said they had her back. Garrett leaned forward, his smile tighter now. "I assure you, Ms. Reeves, we always deliver." Nalani met his eyes and didn't look away. "We'll see," she said softly. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just business anymore. The meeting ended with handshakes and promises to reconvene next week, but as Nalani gathered her things, Garrett lingered by the door. "Have we met before?" he asked suddenly, his voice lower, almost uncertain. "You seem familiar." Nalani paused, her hand on her portfolio, her heart a drumbeat in her throat. She could tell him. She could watch his face change as he realized who she was, watch him scramble to apologize or justify or explain away the past. But instead she smiled, a real smile, small and sharp as a blade. "I have one of those faces," she said, brushing past him into the hallway. She didn't look back. Behind her, she heard him exhale, confused and unsettled. Let him wonder, let him lose sleep trying to place her, because this story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Nalani stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, she finally let herself breathe. The girl he'd broken was gone. But the woman she'd become, she was just getting started. The summer Nalani turned 22, Chicago felt like it was trying to cook her alive. The bus from her apartment in Bronzeville to the West Loop took 40 minutes on a good day, longer when the AC broke and passengers fanned themselves with old newspapers and complained to nobody in particular. Nalani didn't complain. She sat by the window, her interview outfit a navy blazer from Goodwill and a crisp white blouse she'd ironed twice, protected by a dry cleaning bag draped across her lap. Her mama had taught her that looking the part was half the battle, even if you had to fake it with secondhand clothes and confidence you didn't quite feel yet. This job at Morrison & Hale Marketing was supposed to be her big break, the door that would crack open a future bigger than the South Side neighborhood where she'd grown up watching dreams die young. She pressed her forehead to the warm glass and watched the city roll past. Brick buildings and corner stores giving way to sleek towers that seemed to touch the sky itself. Morrison & Hale occupied the 11th floor of a limestone building that smelled like coffee and printer ink and ambition. Nalani stepped off the elevator into a lobby decorated with abstract art and leather furniture that looked too expensive to actually sit on. The receptionist, a thin white woman with hair so blonde it was almost silver, barely glanced up when Nalani approached. "I'm here for an interview," Nalani said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Nalani Reeves, 9:30 with Mr. Garrett Finch." The receptionist typed something into her computer, her long nails clicking against the keys. "Take a seat," she said, nodding toward the leather chairs Nalani had been afraid to touch. "He's running behind." Nalani sat, smoothing her skirt over her knees, and waited. Around her, people in sharp suits hurried past, their voices confident and fast, their laughter easy. She wanted to belong here so badly it hurt. She wanted to prove that a girl from Bronzeville could make it in their world, could be just as smart, just as valuable. Garrett Finch finally appeared 30 minutes later, striding through the lobby like he owned not just the floor, but the whole damn building. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with sandy hair starting to thin at the temples and a jawline that probably looked good in the college rowing photos Nalani imagined hung somewhere in his childhood home. He wore a gray suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body. And when he shook her hand, his grip was firm and brief, like he'd already decided something about her before she'd even opened her mouth. "Nalani," he said, mispronouncing it slightly. "Nulani instead of Nalani." She didn't correct him. "Let's talk in my office." She followed him down a hallway lined with framed campaign posters, beer ads, car commercials, political slogans, each one a little piece of proof that this firm knew how to sell things. Garrett's office was corner-facing, windows overlooking the street below, and his desk was organized in a way that felt almost aggressive. Everything at right angles and perfectly aligned. The interview started easy enough. Garrett asked about her degree in communications from University of Illinois, her internship at a small PR firm on the South Side, her ideas about brand positioning in an increasingly diverse market. Nalani spoke carefully, choosing her words like stones to build a bridge between who she was and who she needed him to believe she could be. She talked about campaigns that could reach Black and brown communities without feeling exploitative, about authenticity in advertising, about the future of marketing in a change in America. Garrett listened, nodding occasionally, his pen tapping against his desk in that rhythm she'd later come to know too well. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "You've got ideas," he said finally. "I'll give you that. But this industry isn't about ideas alone. It's about execution, relationships, knowing how to play the game." Nalani nodded, eager. "I'm ready to learn," she said. "I'm a fast learner." Garrett smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll see." He hired her on the spot. Assistant account coordinator, entry level, the kind of job where you made copies and took notes and stayed late without overtime because you were building your career. Nalani didn't care. She was in. She rode the bus home that evening with her heart so full she thought it might burst, already imagining the call she'd make to her mama, the pride in her voice when she said, "I got it." She didn't see the cracks yet, didn't notice the way Garrett's smile had been just a little too tight, the way his eyes had lingered, not on her face, but somewhere around her hair, her clothes, the parts of her that marked her as different from the other assistants in the office, the ones who looked like they'd grown up in his same world, who spoke his same language without even trying. Nalani would learn soon enough that getting through the door was the easy part. It was staying in the room that would break her. 3 months into the job, Nalani realized she'd made a terrible mistake thinking hard work would be enough. She arrived early every morning before the sun fully cracked over Lake Michigan and stayed late every night, long after the cleaning crew had emptied the trash and vacuumed the carpets. She proofread campaign drafts until her eyes burned, organized client files with obsessive precision, and volunteered for every extra task Garrett or the senior coordinators threw her way. She wanted to be indispensable, the kind of employee they couldn't imagine the office running without. But every time she walked into a meeting, every time she offered an idea or a solution, she felt the same thing. A wall of polite indifference, like she was speaking a language nobody else could quite hear. Her suggestions were met with nods, and "we'll consider that." And then, days later, she'd hear the same idea come out of someone else's mouth, usually Todd's. And suddenly it was brilliant, worth implementing, worth crediting. She started keeping a notebook of every idea she shared, and every time it was stolen, a quiet inventory of erasure she didn't know what to do with yet. Todd Brennan was Garrett's favorite from day one, and he wore that favoritism like a varsity jacket he never took off. He was 24, fresh from Northwestern's business school, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to prove you belonged anywhere. His dad played golf with one of Morrison & Hale's biggest clients, connection Todd mentioned casually, often, like it was just a fun coincidence and not the reason he'd gotten the job in the first place. He spent more time in Garrett's office than at his own desk, the two of them laughing over some inside joke or discussing football games Nalani had no reference for. When Garrett assigned the big projects, the ones that could make or break a young coordinator's career, he gave them to Todd. When clients came in for presentations, Todd stood at the front of the room while Nalani sat in the back, taking notes nobody would ever read. She told herself it was temporary, that if she just worked harder, stayed longer, proved herself more, eventually Garrett would see her. Eventually, she'd get her chance. That chance seemed to come in late September when Garrett called her into his office and dropped a thick folder on his desk. "New client," he said. not looking up from his computer screen. Local nonprofit focusing on youth mentorship in underserved communities. They want a campaign that feels authentic, grassroots. I thought you might have some insights. Nalani's heart leapt. This was it. A project that actually fit her background, her perspective, the lived experience she brought to the table that nobody else in the office had. She took the folder home that night and didn't sleep, filling pages with ideas, slogans, visuals that could speak to kids who looked like she looked growing up, who needed to see themselves reflected in something bigger than their circumstances. She researched similar campaigns, interviewed friends who ran community programs, crafted a presentation that felt less like advertising and more like a love letter to the neighborhoods she came from. When she walked into Garrett's office 3 days later with her pitch, she was exhausted and exhilarated, her hands shaking slightly as she laid out poster boards and mock-ups across his desk. Garrett flipped through her work slowly, his face unreadable. Nalani stood there, her breath caught somewhere between hope and dread, waiting for him to say something, anything. Finally, he looked up. "This is good," he said, and relief flooded through her like warm water. "Really good. You put a lot of thought into this." She smiled, her first real smile in weeks. "Thank you. I think if we position it right, we could..." "I'm going to have Todd take the lead on this," Garrett interrupted, his tone casual, like he was discussing lunch plans. Nalani's smile froze. "What?" "Todd's got more experience with client-facing presentations," Garrett continued, already turning back to his computer. "But your research here is solid. He'll use it as a foundation." Nalani felt something crack inside her chest, small and sharp. "But this is my work," she said quietly. "I know the community. I understand. And Todd will make sure that understanding translates to the client," Garrett said, his voice firmer now, a warning. "This is a team effort, Nalani. Don't make it personal." She left his office with her poster boards under her arm and her throat so tight she couldn't swallow. In the bathroom, she locked herself in a stall and pressed her forehead against the cool metal door, trying not to cry, trying not to scream. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair, but fairness wasn't part of the equation here. She was learning that the hard way. 2 weeks later, Todd presented his campaign to the nonprofit's board, and it was a hit. Garrett praised him in front of the entire department, clapping him on the shoulder like a proud father. "This is the kind of innovative thinking we need," Garrett said, smiling wide. "Great work, Todd." Nalani sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen, her reflection faint in the dark glass. She didn't recognize herself anymore. The girl who'd walked into this building 3 months ago, full of hope and hunger, was disappearing, and nobody seemed to notice she was gone. By December, Nalani had learned to make herself smaller. She stopped volunteering ideas in meetings, stopped staying late to perfect projects that would be handed to someone else, stopped believing that effort equaled reward. She showed up, did her tasks, went home. The fire that had driven her to this job in the first place had dimmed to a cold, survivalist ember, just enough to keep her employed, not enough to keep her dreaming. Her mama noticed during their Sunday phone calls, her voice soft and worried. "You sound tired, baby," she'd say. "You taking care of yourself?" Nalani would lie and say yes, that everything was fine, that the job was just demanding, that it was all part of paying dues. But the truth sat heavier every day. She was drowning in a place that didn't want to save her, and she didn't know how to swim to shore. The only thing keeping her afloat was the paycheck, the rent it covered, the proof that she hadn't failed yet, even if it felt like she was failing every single day. The annual holiday party was held at a downtown hotel, one of those glittering ballrooms with chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls and servers in bow ties carrying trays of champagne. Nalani almost didn't go, but her coworker Simone, a Black woman in accounting who'd been at the firm for 5 years, convinced her. You gotta show face, Simone said, adjusting Nalani's collar in the bathroom mirror before they left the office. Let them see you exist, even if they act like you don't. So Nalani went, wearing a simple black dress she'd borrowed from her cousin and heels that made her feet ache after 20 minutes. She stood near the bar, sipping ginger ale because she couldn't afford to let her guard down, and watched her coworkers laugh and dance and celebrate a year of success she'd contributed to but would never be credited for. Garrett stood in the center of it all, his tie loosened, his arm around Todd's shoulders, both of them red-faced and loud from too much whiskey. Nalani was about to leave when Garrett spotted her. He waved her over, his smile too wide, his eyes glassy. "Nalani," he called out, loud enough that people turned to look. Come here. She hesitated, but refusing felt more dangerous than complying, so she crossed the room. Garrett draped his arm over her shoulder, heavy and too familiar, and she stiffened. "This is Nalani," he announced to the small circle of senior managers around him. "One of our hardest workers, always got her nose to the grindstone, right?" He squeezed her shoulder, and she could smell the alcohol on his breath, sharp and sour. "Maybe too much, though. You gotta learn to relax, Nalani. Have some fun. Always so." He trailed off, his hand waving vaguely. "Serious?" The managers chuckled politely, and Nalani felt her face burn. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just trying to do good work, sir," she said quietly. Garrett laughed. "See? Serious." He released her and turned back to his conversation, dismissing her like she was a prop he'd finished using. Nalani walked out of that ballroom and didn't stop until she was outside, the December air sharp and cold against her skin. She stood on the sidewalk, her breath fogging in front of her, and let the anger finally rise, hot and clean and undeniable. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't being too sensitive. This place, this man, this whole system was designed to grind her down until she either disappeared or stopped caring. And she was so tired of pretending it was okay. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop, her heels clicking against the pavement, her mind already halfway to a decision she hadn't fully made yet. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not as the invisible girl who worked twice as hard for half the recognition. If she stayed, she'd lose herself completely. And she'd fought too hard, come too far to let Garrett Finch or anyone else take that from her. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, the city lights blurring past the window like tears she refused to cry. The next morning, Nalani walked into Morrison and Hale with an envelope in her hand. She'd written her resignation letter at 3 a.m, her hand shaking but her words clear. She didn't owe them an explanation, didn't owe them anything, but she wrote one anyway. Professional, brief, impossible to argue with. Effective immediately. I am resigning from my position as assistant account coordinator. Thank you for the opportunity. She placed the envelope on Garrett's desk while he was in a meeting, and then she cleaned out her desk. Photos, notebooks, the coffee mug her mama had given her with future CEO printed on the side. Simone found her in the hallway, her box of belongings balanced on her hip. "You leaving?" Simone asked, her voice low, her eyes knowing. Nalani nodded. "I have to." Simone pulled her into a quick, fierce hug. "Go build something better," she whispered. "Don't let these people steal your light." Nalani held on for a moment, then pulled back and walked toward the elevator. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. That version of her life was over. Garrett called her that evening, his voice tight and annoyed. "Nalani, what is this about? You can't just quit without notice. We have projects." "I can, actually," Nalani interrupted, her voice steady. "And I did. Good luck with your projects, Mr. Finch." She hung up before he could respond, and for the first time in months, she felt something like relief. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was freedom, and that was enough to start building on. Nalani sat on her couch that night, her apartment quiet except for the hum of the radiator, and made herself a promise. One day she'd be more than the girl Garrett Finch forgot. One day she'd be the woman he couldn't ignore. She didn't know how yet, but she'd figure it out. She always did. Starting over at 23 felt like trying to rebuild a house with broken tools and no blueprint. Nalani moved back in with her mama for 6 months, sleeping in her childhood bedroom with the faded purple walls and posters of Janet Jackson she'd never taken down. Every morning, she walked to the library on 47th Street and spent hours on the public computers, sending out resumes, researching small firms, reaching out to every contact she'd made during her brief, painful stint at Morrison & Hale. Most emails went unanswered. The ones that did respond offered unpaid internships or part-time gigs that barely covered bus fare. But Nalani took them anyway, piecing together a patchwork income, freelance copywriting for a community newspaper, social media management for a local bakery, late-night shifts answering phones at a telemarketing company that sold insurance to people who couldn't afford it. She was exhausted all the time, her body running on coffee and spite, but she refused to quit. Quitting had saved her once. It wouldn't define her twice. Her big break came from an unexpected place. A classmate from college named Marcus, who'd started a tiny marketing consultancy out of his basement in Hyde Park. He needed help with a campaign for a Black-owned hair care line trying to break into major retailers. And he remembered Nalani's final project from their senior seminar, a mock campaign for a fictional beauty brand that had earned her the only A+ in the class. "You still got that fire?" Marcus asked when he called her. "Because I need someone who understands the culture, not just the demographics." Nalani didn't hesitate. "I've got it," she said. "When do we start?" They launched the campaign on a shoestring budget, guerrilla marketing tactics, partnerships with local salons, grassroots influencer outreach, before influencer was even a common term. It worked. The hair care line got picked up by a regional drugstore chain, and suddenly Marcus's consultancy wasn't so tiny anymore. He offered Nalani a full-time position, and for the first time since leaving Morrison & Hale, she felt like she could breathe without her chest aching. Over the next decade, Nalani built herself into someone Garrett Finch would never recognize. She learned the business inside and out, not just the creative side, but the numbers, the client relations, the strategic positioning that turned good ideas into profitable realities. She took night classes in business management, saved every dollar she could, and when Marcus decided to move to Atlanta to be closer to family, she bought him out and renamed the consultancy. Reeves and Associates didn't sound like much at first, just her and 2 junior employees working out of a cramped office in Pilsen, but Nalani ran it like it was already an empire. She was meticulous, hungry, and fiercely protective of her team. She hired people who looked like her, who came from neighborhoods like hers, who'd been overlooked and underestimated their whole lives, and she made sure they knew their work mattered, their voices mattered, they mattered. She refused to build the kind of place that had tried to break her. She built the opposite. By the time Nalani turned 40, Reeves and Associates had grown into one of the most respected minority-owned marketing firms in the Midwest. She landed contracts with national brands looking to authentically reach diverse audiences, and her reputation for delivering results without selling out had made her a sought-after voice in the industry. She spoke at conferences, mentored young professionals, and quietly funded scholarships for kids from the South Side who wanted to study communications. She bought her mama a house in Chatham with a backyard and a porch swing, and when she handed over the keys, her mama cried and held her face in both hands. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You really did it." Nalani smiled, but there was a part of her that still felt hollow, a part that remembered being 22 and invisible and told she wasn't good enough. Success was sweet, but it didn't erase the taste of humiliation. Some wounds just scar over. They don't disappear. 15 years after Nalani walked out of Morrison & Hale, she moved her company to Seattle, a calculated risk, a strategic expansion into the West Coast market. She was 55 now, her hair natural and silvering at the temples, her wardrobe full of tailored blazers and custom leather boots that cost more than her first car. She carried herself differently than she had at 22. Shoulders back, voice steady, eyes that didn't apologize for taking up space. She'd earned every inch of her confidence, every scar that taught her how to survive and then thrive. And when her assistant handed her the file on a potential new partnership with a firm called Finch and Lowry Consulting, Nalani stared at the name on the cover page for a long time. Garrett Finch, senior partner. The past had a way of circling back, she thought. And this time she wasn't the one who'd be caught off guard. Nalani spent 3 days preparing for the partnership meeting with Finch and Lowry, not because she needed that long to understand the proposal, but because she needed time to steady herself. Every time she looked at Garrett's name in the briefing documents, something old and sharp twisted in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the memory of pain. The ghost of the girl she used to be standing in the shadow of the woman she'd become. She told herself this was just business, another negotiation in a career full of them. But late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd stand by her apartment window overlooking Elliott Bay and admit the truth. This wasn't just business. This was reckoning. She wanted to look Garrett Finch in the eye as an equal and watch him realize too late what he'd missed. She wanted him to see what she'd built without him, in spite of him, because of him, and she wanted it to hurt, just a little, the way his dismissal had hurt her all those years ago. The morning of the meeting, Nalani dressed with military precision, burgundy blazer, black silk blouse, tailored pants that made her look taller than her 5'6" frame. She wore the diamond studs her mama had given her when Reeves and Associates landed its first $1 million contract, small but flawless, a reminder of how far she'd come. Her assistant, a sharp 28-year-old named Kira, who reminded Nalani of her younger self, handed her a coffee and a folder as they stepped into the elevator. "You good, boss?" Kira asked, her eyes knowing. Nalani took a sip of coffee, letting the heat ground her. "I'm good," she said, and she was. She'd spent 33 years preparing for this moment, even if she hadn't known it. She was more than ready. She was dangerous. And Garrett Finch had no idea what was coming. The conference room was all glass and steel and expensive views, the kind of space designed to intimidate, to remind everyone in it that power had a price tag. Garrett's team was already seated when Nalani walked in. 3 men and 1 woman, all white, all wearing that same look of polite professionalism that barely masked their assumptions. And then there was Garrett at the head of the table, older now, but still recognizable. His hair had gone mostly gray, his face softer around the edges, but his posture was the same, confident, entitled, the posture of someone who'd never had to fight for a seat at any table. When he looked up and saw Nalani, something flickered in his eyes, confusion, maybe a glimmer of recognition, but it passed quickly. He stood, extended his hand, and smiled that corporate smile she'd seen 1,000 times before. "Ms. Reeves," he said, "I've heard impressive things about your firm." Nalani shook his hand, her grip firm, her smile cool and measured. "Mr. Finch," she replied, "I'm sure you have." The meeting proceeded with all the choreographed predictability of these things, PowerPoints and projections, carefully worded proposals, veiled negotiations disguised as collaboration. Garrett spoke about market synergies and growth opportunities, his voice smooth and practiced, the voice of someone used to being heard. And Nalani listened, nodding occasionally, her face a mask of professional interest, while her mind worked 3 steps ahead. She noticed the way Garrett directed most of his comments to her male colleagues, the way he assumed her CFO, a black man named Terrence, was making the final decisions. She noticed the way he used phrases like diversity initiatives and inclusive marketing without irony, without acknowledging that her entire firm was built on authenticity he clearly didn't understand. And she noticed most of all the way he still didn't recognize her. 33 years, and she'd been so forgettable that even sitting across from him now, she was still invisible. That should have hurt. Instead, it felt like power. When it was Nalani's turn to speak, she leaned forward, her hands folded on the table, her voice calm and clear. "Your proposal is solid on paper," she began, "but I have concerns about execution. Your firm's track record with minority-owned businesses shows a pattern of overpromising and under-delivering. The Jackson campaign in 2019, the Rivera partnership in 2021, both ended in litigation because your team failed to honor contractual commitments." She watched Garrett's face tighten, his smile faltering. "If we're going to partner, I need more than projections. I need guarantees, accountability, and transparency. My company's reputation is built on trust, and I don't compromise that for anyone." The room went silent. Garrett's colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Terrence, sitting beside Nalani, fought back a smile. This was her power now, not just success, but the ability to demand respect and get it. Garrett cleared his throat, his eyes harder now. "Ms. Reeves, I'm sure you do," Nalani interrupted smoothly. "But assurances aren't enough. We'll reconvene when you have concrete answers." She stood, gathering her things, and her team followed. As she reached the door, Garrett called out, "Have we met before?" Nalani paused, her hand on the door frame, and looked back at him. For a moment, she considered telling him everything: who she was, what he'd done, how he'd tried to break her and failed. But instead, she smiled, small and enigmatic. "I have one of those faces," she said, and then she left, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her heart pounding with something that felt like victory. The game had just begun, and she was already winning. Garrett Finch couldn't stop thinking about Nalani Reeves. It bothered him in a way he couldn't quite name, like an itch under his skin he couldn't reach. He sat in his office 3 days after their meeting, staring at her firm's portfolio on his computer screen, scrolling through case studies and client testimonials that painted a picture of a woman who was brilliant, relentless, and impossible to ignore. He built a career on reading people, on knowing who to invest in and who to dismiss, but Nalani was a puzzle he couldn't solve. She moved through their meeting with the kind of confidence that came from real power, not inherited privilege, and she called him out in front of his entire team without flinching. Nobody did that to him, nobody. And yet something about her felt familiar, a nagging sense that he should know her from somewhere, that their paths had crossed before in a context he couldn't quite remember. It gnawed at him, persistent and uncomfortable, like a name on the tip of his tongue he couldn't quite speak. Nalani, meanwhile, was 3 moves ahead. She sat in her corner office, the Seattle skyline stretched out behind her, and reviewed the dossier her team had compiled on Garrett and his firm. She read about his expansion into diversity consulting, his partnerships with minority-owned businesses that looked good in press releases but often ended in quiet settlements and NDAs. She read testimonials from former employees who described a culture of favoritism and subtle discrimination, the kind that was hard to prove but easy to feel. And she read about his personal life, divorced twice, 3 grown children he barely saw, a reputation in the industry as a shark who won at any cost. He hadn't changed. He'd just gotten better at hiding it. Nalani closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, her mind working through her options. She could walk away from this partnership, refuse to do business with a man who represented everything she'd fought against. Or she could use this opportunity to leverage something bigger, a contract that would give her firm access to clients and resources she'd been chasing for years, while also holding Garrett accountable in ways he'd never been before. The decision came easier than she expected. Nalani scheduled a follow-up meeting, but this time on her terms, at her office, with her team present, and with a revised proposal that made it clear who held the power. When Garrett and his associates arrived, they were ushered into a sleek conference room where Nalani's awards lined the walls. Industry recognitions, community honors, framed photos of her with mayors and CEOs and cultural icons. It was a deliberate move, a visual reminder that she didn't need him, but he might need her. Garrett noticed. She saw it in the way his eyes scanned the room, the way his jaw tightened just slightly. Good. Let him feel small for once. Let him understand what it's like to walk into a space that wasn't built for you and have to prove you belong. Nalani entered last, flanked by Kira and Terrence, and took her seat at the head of the table. "Mr. Finch," she said, her tone professional but firm. "Thank you for coming. Let's talk about how we move forward, on my terms." Nalani's revised proposal was a masterpiece of strategic control. She outlined a partnership structure where her firm maintained creative and operational autonomy. With strict performance benchmarks, Garrett's team would have to meet quarterly. Any failure to deliver would result in financial penalties and the option for her to dissolve the partnership without consequence. She included clauses about equitable treatment of vendors, transparent reporting, and a requirement that Garrett's firm undergo third-party audits to verify compliance. It was aggressive, demanding, and completely non-negotiable. Garrett listened, his face carefully neutral, but Nalani could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He needed this deal more than he wanted to admit. His firm's reputation had taken hits recently. In partnering with a respected minority-owned business like Reeves & Associates would rehabilitate his image and open doors that had started closing. He was trapped, and they both knew it. "This is more restrictive than typical partnerships," Garrett said carefully, choosing his words. Nalani smiled sharp and unapologetic. "I don't do typical," she replied. "Take it or leave it." The meeting ended with Garrett asking for time to review the terms with his legal team, but Nalani saw the resignation in his posture. He'd agree. He had to. As his team filed out, Garrett lingered, his hand on the back of a chair, his expression almost vulnerable. "You really don't remember meeting me before?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost uncertain. Nalani stood gathering her materials and met his eyes directly. "Mr. Finch," she said softly, "I remember everything that matters. The question is, do you?" She left him standing there, confusion and something like fear flickering across his face. Kira caught up with her in the hallway, barely containing her grin. "Boss, that was cold," she whispered. Nalani didn't smile, but her eyes gleamed. "That was business," she corrected. But deep down in the part of her that was still 22 and invisible and desperate to be seen, it felt like justice. And just, she was learning, tasted even sweeter than success. 3 weeks into the partnership, Garrett Finch made his first mistake. He tried to overstep. It happened during a joint campaign pitch to a national athletic brand looking to rebrand their community outreach programs. Nalani's team had spent 2 weeks developing a comprehensive strategy that centered authentic voices from underserved neighborhoods, partnerships with local gyms and youth programs, and storytelling that didn't feel like charity but celebration. The presentation was scheduled for a Friday morning, and Nalani arrived at the client's downtown office to find Garrett already in the conference room, chatting comfortably with the brand's VP of marketing like they were old friends, which, as it turned out, they were. Garrett had gone to business school with the VP's older brother, a connection he'd failed to mention when the partnership was being negotiated. Red flags started waving in Nalani's mind immediately, but she kept her face neutral, professional, and took her seat beside Kira and Terrence. The meeting started, and Garrett launched into what was supposed to be a collaborative presentation, except the slides on the screen were all his, and the strategy he outlined bore only surface resemblance to what Nalani's team had developed. Nalani watched in cold, controlled fury as Garrett presented a watered-down version of her campaign, stripped of its cultural specificity and authentic community partnerships, repackaged into something safer, blander, more palatable to executives who'd never set foot in the neighborhoods they claimed to want to serve. He used buzzwords like urban engagement and inclusive messaging without understanding what they actually meant, and he credited the strategy to our combined teams in a way that made it clear he saw himself as the lead. The VP nodded along, impressed by Garrett's confidence and their shared history, barely glancing at Nalani or her team. It was Morrison and Hale all over again. Her work, her ideas, her lived experience being filtered through a white man who thought he could tell her story better than she could. But Nalani wasn't 22 anymore. She wasn't powerless, and she sure as hell wasn't invisible. When Garrett finished and opened the floor for questions, Nalani leaned forward, her voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. I appreciate Mr. Finch's enthusiasm, she began, but what he just presented isn't the strategy our teams agreed upon. The room went silent. The VP's smile faltered. Garrett's eyes snapped to Nalani, surprise and warning flashing across his face. She ignored him. The approach Mr. Finch outlined lacks the cultural authenticity and community partnerships that make this campaign effective. What you're hearing is a sanitized version that might feel safe, but it won't connect with the audiences you're trying to reach. If you want real impact, you need the real strategy, the one my team developed. She nodded to Kira, who pulled up the actual presentation on her laptop and began walking through it, slide by slide, with the kind of detail and passion that made it impossible to ignore. Nalani watched the VP's expression shift from confusion to interest to genuine excitement as Kira explained how they'd partner with local athletes who'd grown up in the target communities, how they'd fund equipment drives and mentorship programs that felt grassroots rather than corporate, how every element of the campaign was designed with input from the people it aimed to serve. By the time Kira finished, the VP was leaning forward, nodding, asking questions that showed he finally understood the difference between performing inclusion and actually practicing it. Garrett tried to recover, interjecting with comments about integrating both approaches and finding middle ground, but the damage was done. The VP looked at Nalani with new respect, the kind of respect that came from recognizing real expertise, and when the meeting ended, he shook her hand firmly. Ms. Reeves, I think we should move forward with your team taking the creative lead on this. Mr. Finch, your firm can handle the back-end logistics, but the vision here is clearly Ms. Reeves's. Nalani smiled graciously, professionally, and agreed. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he nodded and mumbled something about collaboration. As they left the building, Garrett grabbed Nalani's arm in the lobby, his grip just a little too tight, his voice low and angry. What the hell was that? He hissed. You made me look incompetent in front of a client. Nalani pulled her arm free, her eyes cold. You made yourself look incompetent when you tried to steal my work and pass it off as yours. Don't do it again. She walked away, her team flanking her like a protective wall, and didn't look back. But she felt Garrett's stare burning into her back, and she knew this war was just beginning. The confrontation marked a turning point. Garrett stopped trying to charm Nalani and started trying to undermine her. Subtle moves at first, like scheduling meetings without including her team, or making decisions about campaign directions without consultation, or taking credit in client emails for milestones Nalani's staff had achieved. But Nalani had anticipated this. She'd been documenting everything since day one, Every email, every meeting note, every instance of Garrett trying to sidestep their partnership agreement. And when he pushed too far, when he tried to renegotiate the terms behind her back by going directly to her board members, she pushed back harder. Nalani called an emergency meeting with both firms' leadership teams present, laid out the evidence of Garrett's breaches of contract, and calmly, methodically explained that unless he adhered to the terms they'd agreed upon, she'd dissolve the partnership and make sure every potential client knew why. The room was deathly silent. Garrett's face turned red, then pale. He tried to deflect, to claim misunderstandings, but Terrence backed Nalani up with receipts. Literal receipts, financial discrepancies, timeline violations, all laid out in a presentation that left no room for interpretation. When the meeting ended, Garrett was forced to issue a formal apology to Nalani's team and recommit to the partnership structure she'd outlined. It was a public humiliation, the kind that would ripple through industry circles and damage his reputation among peers who valued control above all else. As people filed out of the conference room, Garrett approached Nalani one more time, his voice tired, his arrogance finally stripped away. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "What do you want from me?" Nalani looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd shaped so much of her pain without even remembering her face. "I want you to be better," she said simply. "I want you to understand that people like me aren't disposable. We're not props for your career or obstacles to manage. We're equals, and it's time you learn that." She walked out, leaving Garrett standing alone in the empty conference room, finally, for the first time in his life, forced to reckon with the consequence of his actions. And Nalani felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of release. The girl he dismissed was gone. The woman she'd become had won. 2 months into their tense partnership, Garrett Finch finally figured it out. It happened on a Tuesday evening, late, when most of the office had cleared out, and he was alone in his corner office, nursing a scotch he didn't really want, and scrolling through old files on his computer. He was looking for something else. Contract templates from his Morrison and Hale days, back when the firm was smaller and he was hungrier, still building his name in Chicago, when he stumbled across a folder labeled Personnel 1992. Curiosity pulled him in, and he clicked through outdated employee records, headshots from a different era, people he'd hired and fired and forgotten. And then he saw her, a scanned photo of a young woman with bright eyes and a nervous smile. Her name typed underneath in plain text, Nalani Reeves, Assistant Account Coordinator. Garrett stared at the screen, his scotch forgotten, his breath caught somewhere in his throat. The resemblance was undeniable. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set to her jaw, though the woman in the photo looked softer, unguarded, not yet scarred by the world he'd helped shape for her. He clicked through her file, scanning performance reviews he'd written himself, notes about projects she'd worked on, and then, at the bottom, her resignation letter. Brief, professional, dated December 1992. He remembered her now, in fragments. The young black woman who'd been too serious, too intense, who'd quit without warning right before the holidays. He'd been annoyed at the time, inconvenienced by having to reassign her tasks. But he'd moved on quickly. She'd been replaceable, forgettable, except she wasn't. She'd built an empire brick by brick, and now she was sitting across negotiating tables from him as an equal. No, as someone more powerful, because she'd earned every inch of her success without shortcuts, without connections, without the privilege he'd taken for granted his entire life. Garrett closed the laptop and sat in the dark, the city lights of Seattle glowing through his window, and felt something he wasn't used to feeling: shame. Not the performative kind he'd learned to deploy when it served him, but real bone-deep shame that made his chest ache. He'd dismissed her, he'd stolen her work, he'd humiliated her in front of colleagues, and never even noticed when she disappeared. and she'd spent 33 years rebuilding herself from the wreckage he'd left behind, not to mention the countless others he'd probably done the same thing to over the decades. How many bright, young professionals had he broken without remembering their names? How many Nalanis were out there carrying scars he'd inflicted and forgotten? The scotch tasted like ash in his mouth, and for the first time in years, Garrett Finch felt small. The next morning, Garrett requested a private meeting with Nalani. She agreed, curious but guarded, and they met in a neutral space, a coffee shop downtown, away from offices and witnesses, where conversations could be honest without being performances. Garrett arrived first, ordered 2 coffees, even though he didn't know how she took hers anymore, and sat by the window, his hands shaking slightly. When Nalani walked in, she looked every bit the CEO she'd become. Tailored coat, confident stride, eyes that missed nothing. She sat across from him, ignored the coffee, and waited. "I know who you are," Garrett said quietly without preamble. "I found your file from Morrison and Hale. I remember you now." Nalani's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. "Took you long enough," she said evenly. Garrett nodded, accepting the blow. "I owe you an apology," he continued, his voice raw in a way he wasn't used to. "For what I did back then. For not seeing you. For taking your work and giving you nothing in return. For making you feel like you didn't matter. You did matter. You do matter. And I'm sorry." Nalani sat back, studying him, her face unreadable. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times over the years. Garrett apologized, and finally understanding what he'd done, groveling for forgiveness she might or might not give. But now that it was happening, she didn't feel the rush of triumph she'd expected. Instead, she felt tired. Tired of carrying this weight, tired of letting him live rent-free in the corners of her mind, tired of defining herself in opposition to a man who'd never deserved that much power over her life. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why does it matter to you now?" Garrett looked down at his hands, struggling for honesty. "Because I'm tired of being the villain in everyone's story," he admitted. "Because I'm 60 years old, and I've built a career on stepping over people like you, and I don't know if I've ever actually earned anything I have, because you've done everything right and I've done everything wrong, and somehow you're still here, still fighting, still winning, and I don't know how to live with that." Nalani almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "That's not my burden to carry," she said. "Your guilt, your reckoning, that's yours. I didn't come back into your life to absolve you." "I know," Garrett said quickly. "I'm not asking you to. I needed you to know that I see you now. I see what I did, and I see what you've become, and I'm sorry I wasn't better back then." Nalani was quiet for a long time, watching the steam rise from the coffee she hadn't touched. She thought about the girl she'd been, so desperate for approval, so willing to dim her light to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. And she thought about the woman she'd become, scarred, yes, but strong, resilient, unbreakable. Garrett's apology didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the nights she'd cried herself to sleep wondering if she was good enough. But it was something, a closing, a period at the end of a sentence that had been hanging incomplete for over 3 decades. "I accept your apology," Nalani said finally, her voice soft but firm. "But that doesn't mean I trust you. It doesn't mean we're friends. It just means I'm done letting you live in my head rent-free." Garrett nodded, relief and something like gratitude washing over his face. "That's more than I deserve," he said. Nalani stood gathering her coat. "It's exactly what you deserve," she corrected. "Not more, not less." And then she walked out, leaving Garrett alone with his coffee and his conscience, finally, blessedly free. 6 months later, Nalani stood in front of a ballroom full of industry leaders at the National Marketing Excellence Awards in San Francisco, holding a crystal trophy that caught the light like captured starlight. She'd just won the Lifetime Achievement Award. the highest honor in their field, and the applause was still ringing in her ears as she approached the podium. Her mama was in the front row, wearing her best church dress and crying happy tears. And Kira and Terrence sat beside her, beaming with pride. Nalani looked out at the sea of faces, peers, competitors, mentors, and yes, Garrett Finch sitting toward the back, his expression unreadable. She thought a lot about this moment, about what she'd say if she ever got here. And in the end, she decided to tell the truth. Not the sanitized, polished version that made everyone comfortable, but the messy, painful, triumphant truth of how she'd survived and built something beautiful from ruins. 33 years ago, she began, her voice clear and steady. I was 22 years old, working at a firm in Chicago, and I thought I was doing everything right. I worked harder than anyone else. I stayed later. I gave more, and I was invisible. The room went quiet, people leaning forward, caught by the rawness in her voice. Nalani continued, letting the story unfold, not naming Garrett by name, but making it clear enough that anyone who'd lived similar experiences would recognize the pattern. She talked about stolen ideas and broken promises, about being gaslit into thinking she wasn't good enough, about the day she walked away and rebuilt herself from nothing. I tell you this, she said, her voice stronger now. Not for pity, but because I know I'm not the only one. There's so many of us, Black women, people of color, anyone who's been told they're not quite right, not quite ready, not quite enough, who've had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. And we're tired, but we're also unstoppable. The applause started soft and built. Like a wave, people standing, nodding, some wiping their eyes. Nalani saw Garrett stand too, his face pale, his hands clapping mechanically, and she knew he understood she was talking about him without saying his name. It was a gift, that anonymity and a warning. She could have destroyed him publicly. She chose not to, but he'd know forever that she'd held that power and exercised mercy instead. After the ceremony, Nalani stood in the hotel lobby, her trophy carefully wrapped and tucked under her arm, saying goodbyes and accepting congratulations. Garrett approached last, hesitant, his hands in his pockets. That was a powerful speech, he said quietly. Brave. Nalani looked at him. This man who'd loomed so large in her past and now seemed smaller, older, diminished not by age, but by the weight of his own limitations. It was true, she replied simply. That's all it needed to be. Garrett nodded, and for a moment they just stood there, two people who'd traveled wildly different paths that had somehow circled back to the same point. You know, Garrett said slowly, I used to think success meant never looking back, never doubting, never apologizing. But watching you, you've taught me that real strength is being able to face what you've done and grow from it. I'm trying to do that now with my firm, with how I lead. It's not easy. Nalani softened slightly. It's not supposed to be easy, she said. Nothing worth doing is. They talked for a few more minutes, not as enemies, not quite as friends, but as two people who'd finally met each other as equals, stripped of the power dynamics that had defined their first encounter. Garrett told her about changes he was making at his firm, hiring more diversely, implementing mentorship programs, actually listening to voices he'd ignored before. Nalani didn't know if it would last, didn't know if one man's redemption arc could undo decades of systemic problems, but she appreciated the effort. And when they finally shook hands and parted ways, she felt something she hadn't expected: lightness. The weight she'd carried for 33 years, the need to prove herself to a man who'd never deserved the power over her life, was finally gone. She didn't need Garrett's validation anymore. She never had. She only needed her own. And that she'd always had, even when she'd forgotten it, even when the world tried to convince her otherwise. She'd always been enough. Nalani walked out of the hotel into the San Francisco night, the fog rolling in from the bay. the city lights glowing soft and golden. Her mama was waiting by the car, and when Nalani reached her, she pulled her into a long, tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, baby," her mama whispered. "Your daddy would be so proud too." Nalani held on, letting herself be small for just a moment, letting herself feel the full weight of everything she'd overcome and everything she'd become. "I'm proud of me too, Mama," she whispered back, and she was. Not because she'd won awards or built an empire or forced a man to apologize, but because she'd survived, because she'd refused to let bitterness poison her, because she'd built something beautiful and true that would outlast her, that would open doors for young women who looked like her and needed to see proof that it was possible. That was legacy. That was victory. That was enough. Years later, when people asked Nalani about her success, about how she'd built Reeves and Associates into one of the most respected firms in the country, she'd tell them it started with a choice. The choice to leave a place that diminished her, the choice to bid on herself when nobody else would, the choice to build something better instead of just surviving something broken. And sometimes when she was mentoring young professionals who reminded her of her 22-year-old self, she'd tell them about Garrett too, not as a villain, but as a reminder that you can't control how people see you, but you can control how you see yourself, that the people who underestimate you are giving you a gift, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. They're showing you exactly who not to become, and that's worth more than any trophy, any title, any partnership. Nalani Reeves had met her former boss again, 33 years later, and they'd stood as equals. But the truth was, she'd always been his equal. He'd just been too blind to see it. And by the time he finally did, she'd already moved so far beyond him that his recognition didn't matter anymore. She'd learned the hardest and most important lesson of all. You don't need permission to be powerful. You just need to refuse to be small. And Nalani Reeves had never been small, not at 22, not at 55, not ever. She'd just been waiting for the world to catch up. And finally, beautifully, it had.